Something sinister is approaching the Earth, mercilessly destroying everything in its path. Only one ship and one crew are in any position to confront this giant monstrosity, and it is up to Admiral Kirk and the USS Enterprise, fresh from a years-long redesign, to enter the maw of the unknown to find answers before V'ger swallows up all of mankind. Before we begin, please hit that like button, and if you really do like this video, make sure to subscribe for more content. Creators are often assaulted by forces beyond our understanding looking for answers, but with any luck, I can keep them satisfied with your digital support, so thank you in advance. With that out of the way, let's get back to the subject at hand. In 1966, NBC debuted a daring science fiction television show called Star Trek. Created by veteran World War II Air Force pilot turned screenwriter Gene Roddenberry, who pitched the show as a wagon train to the stars, Star Trek earned lackluster reviews and consistently lost out to its competition on the other two networks in its time slot. It had a dedicated fan base who were able to organize a letter-writing campaign to save it from getting cut from NBC's slate after 2 seasons, but with a 3rd season that suffered from Roddenberry's lack of input and a significantly reduced budget, it couldn't be saved from the studio axe in 1969. A few years later, however, and throughout the early 70s, Star Trek became a massive hit in syndication. Paramount Pictures, who owned the rights to the property, launched Star Trek the Animated Series, which lasted for 2 seasons, and took a few different pitches for a Star Trek movie, an idea that had been floating around since before the show had even been cancelled. Many writers came forward with treatments, including the likes of Ray Bradbury and Harlan Ellison. Gene Roddenberry himself developed a screenplay called The God Thing, which was about an entity from another dimension that comes to Earth claiming to be God before the Enterprise is able to send it back from whence it came. Paramount rejected Roddenberry's pitch at the time over religious objections, but that wasn't the end of the line for The God Thing. Another pitch that was met with far more approval was Star Trek Planet of the Titans, which was to be produced in Britain on a reduced budget by the writing duo of Chris Bryant and Alan Scott. Planet of the Titans had a wild plot that included Captain Kirk being lost on an invisible planet for 3 years as it is slowly pulled into a black hole that ultimately winds up sending the Enterprise crew back to the Paleolithic era. Several directors were sought for the project, including Francis Ford Coppola, George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, and Robert Wise. But it was Philip Kaufman who finally agreed to direct. The writers, producers, Roddenberry, and Kaufman all had different visions of the film, and there was a significant amount of tension as a result. There were also problems with William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy, each of whom had dropped out at various stages over contract negotiations. One early script had Captain Kirk written out entirely, while others had reduced Spock to little more than a cameo that could be cut if needed. Pre-production began in earnest by the end of 1976, with design work being done by Ken Adam and Ralph McQuarrie, whose version of the Enterprise would eventually go on to inspire the Enterprise D featured in Star Trek The Next Generation. Eventually, however, because of the conflicting visions for the film and a lack of faith in science fiction films in general, the project was cancelled in early 1977. Paramount, now preparing to debut a new television network to compete with the Big Three, pulled a reluctant Roddenberry back to resurrect the original series for a new show called Star Trek Phase 2. The story of Star Trek Phase 2 is a long and fascinating one that we don't have time to get into here, but suffice it to say, after several false starts and millions of dollars being spent on pre-production, Paramount eventually decided to ditch Star Trek Phase 2 in November of 1977, less than 3 weeks before cameras were scheduled to roll. This is not to say the work done on the series was all for naught, as many of its ideas and developed concepts would make their way into Star Trek throughout the years, especially informing Star Trek The Next Generation. What is relevant for today's subject, however, are the creation of the character of Lieutenant Ilia, a Deltan woman to be played by Persis Khambatta, an Indian beauty queen turned actress, and the development of an episode called In Thy Image, which was to be Phase 2's 2-hour pilot. In Thy Image, which was written by British sci-fi author Alan Dean Foster, was loosely based on Roddenberry's earlier film script for The God Thing, mixed with another of Roddenberry's ideas called Robot's Return, and its story involved a giant unknown object called V'ger menacing the Earth in search of its creator. The studio was still uncomfortable with some of the underlying religious and philosophical ideas of the story, so the science fiction grandmaster Isaac Asimov was brought in to offer some polish and reassure dubious producers that the idea of a sentient machine is perfectly in line with scientific reality and does not conflict with the theological mainstream. Thanks in no small part to Asimov's contributions, Foster's treatment for In Thy Image was eventually greenlit and then turned into a teleplay by writer Harold Livingston. After Phase 2 was cancelled, and after the subsequent groundbreaking success of Star Wars, the decision was made to once again develop Star Trek into a feature film. The president and CEO of Paramount at the time, Michael Eisner, was so enamored with the script for In Thy Image that he insisted it be the basis for the new movie. And with the enthusiastic help of executive producer Jeffrey Katzenberg, development finally began on Star Trek the Motion Picture. After Close Encounters of the Third Kind proved that the box office success of Star Wars wasn't just a fluke, practically every studio in Hollywood began developing sci-fi projects, so pre-production on Star Trek the Motion Picture was fast-tracked. The script for In Thy Image was given back to Livingston to rework it as a film and to write in the character of Spock, as Leonard Nimoy had declined to be a part of Phase 2, but was now willing to participate in the motion picture. On March 28, 1978, Paramount held an enormous press conference to announce the project, to announce the return of the entire cast, and to announce the hiring of legendary director Robert Wise, famous for such classics as The Day the Earth Stood Still, Run Silent, Run Deep, and The Haunting. Wise was only passingly familiar with Star Trek at the time, but he liked the script and was given a crash course in Star Trek lore by Paramount, who loaned him about a dozen of what they considered to be the most important episodes of the original series. Alongside the entire main cast from the television show, which included Roddenberry's wife Majel Barrett as Christine Chapel and Grace Lee Whitney as Janice Rand, Persis Khambatta agreed to stay on as Lieutenant Ilea, the role that had originally been conceived of as a new regular for Phase 2. There are a few notable cameos in the film as well. David Gautreaux, who had been hired to be the Vulcan science officer Zahn as a replacement for Spock in Phase 2, plays the minor role of Commander Branch, and Mark Lenard, best known for playing Spock's father Sarek, plays the doomed Klingon commander in the movie's opening sequence. Finally, Chief DeFalco, the navigator who replaces Ilea on the bridge halfway through the movie, is played by Marcy Lafferty, who was William Shatner's wife at the time. As almost the entire cast had already been signed by the time Robert Wise was brought on board, he was only involved in the hiring of Stephen Collins as Commander Decker, the captain of the Enterprise who was given a field demotion by Admiral Kirk to become the executive officer. Collins was a relatively unknown actor who'd done mostly television work, but nowadays he's known for his 11-year stint as Reverend Eric Camden in Seventh Heaven. While we're on the subject of the cast, Wise was adamant that there be a briefing scene in which most of the crew of the Enterprise is assembled in one place. The crew is largely made up of Star Trek fans, including Betty Trimble, the woman who, with her husband John, organized the letter-writing campaign that convinced NBC to give Star Trek a third season. Also present were various cast and crew associates, including Millicent Wise, the director's second wife. For the music, Gene Roddenberry sought Jerry Goldsmith, his first choice to do the music for the original series. Goldsmith had declined back in 1966 due to other commitments, but he was now eager to answer Roddenberry's call for Star Trek the Motion Picture. Goldsmith was inspired by George Lucas's approach to Star Wars. Lucas had instructed his composer, John Williams, to give the space opera a grandiose romantic feeling. Before that, science fiction scores were usually avant-garde and experimental, an approach Goldsmith himself was very familiar with after his work on Planet of the Apes and Logan's Run. Goldsmith decided to forego most of his usual experimentalism and to resist the urge to use Alexander Courage's theme for the original series, but he did struggle for quite a long time to come up with a theme of his own. When he finally did, after several failed attempts, it became one of Star Trek's most well-known musical cues, later serving as the main theme of Star Trek The Next Generation. It is arguably more well-known today than even Courage's original. Despite a more flowery musical score, Goldsmith did sprinkle in a few experimental instruments and ideas. Most notably, he used a conceptual electronic instrument called a blaster beam to produce the iconic one-note V'ger theme. Goldsmith loved working on Star Trek the Motion Picture. As it was an effects-heavy spectacle built around long, sweeping shots without much dialogue, Goldsmith was given far more freedom and time than movie composers usually enjoy to develop organic musical transitions and thematic elaborations he would otherwise have to abandon. After Star Trek the Motion Picture, Goldsmith would return to the franchise to do 4 more Star Trek films and to compose the title theme for Star Trek Voyager. Principal photography on Star Trek the Motion Picture began less than 6 months after it was officially announced, even though the script wouldn't be finished for another 4 months after that, and most of the effects hadn't even been decided upon. For Wise and the crew, it was a breakneck, stressful, hectic shoot that was barely holding on through the Herculean efforts of Katzenberg to rally everyone together, but from the point of view of the cast, it seemed relatively easygoing. The shoot wrapped in January of 1979, though there was still an enormous amount of post-production and effects work to be done. Paramount had already committed to a December release date and couldn't budge, so Wise was forced to split the effects work between two firms, John Dykstra's Apogee Inc. and Douglas Trumbull's special effects house. Ironically, both Dykstra and Trumbull had been approached very early in pre-production but had turned down the project, only to agree later on when the time crunch became more harrowing. Dykstra was still relatively new to the industry at the time, though he had worked under Trumbull on Silent Running and had been a special effects supervisor on Star Wars, which is where he'd made a name for himself. Trumbull, on the other hand, was already a huge name, having worked on Stanley Kubrick's 2001, Robert Wise's The Andromeda Strain, his own Silent Running, and most recently Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Though Dykstra was ostensibly responsible for the photographic visual effects while Trumbull was in charge of the special effects, the work the two teams did was pretty evenly split, making it virtually impossible to tease out which effects to attribute to which group. Still, with such an accelerated timeline and a limited budget, neither team was completely happy with the final product, and many important sequences were never even started, much less finished. Critically, several shots near the climax that would show the enormous V'ger craft in its entirety as it attacks the Earth were reduced to a handful of computer displays and reaction shots, and in the theatrical cut of the film, there are no shots of the entire V'ger craft, even though it was lovingly designed by famed futurist Sid Mead. The editing was no less contentious. Along with a strict release date, Paramount had also mandated a maximum runtime for the final cut of the film, ensuring that it would be able to be shown a certain number of times in each theater upon release. The preliminary cut was much longer than this, though, and so Wise and his editor Tom Ramsey had to decide what to cut and what to keep. They ultimately decided on a philosophy of keeping as much of the effects and spectacle as possible, even if it was at the expense of important character moments. This had the paradoxical effect of making the final cut of the film feel longer than the preliminary one, but there wasn't enough time to get things to where Wise and Ramsey would have liked. There wasn't even enough time to do a preview screening that could have caught this problem, and so almost no one had seen the final cut before it was shipped out, often still drying in the film cans, to theaters. The schedule was so tight, in fact, that Wise had his final cut as a carry-on on his airplane flight to the premiere, which happened on December 7th, 1979. The film made a worldwide box office gross of $139 million, which adjusted for inflation is actually the franchise's highest. Despite this, critics were unimpressed, dismissing the film as ploddingly slow and weak on thrills, noting its lack of a compelling antagonist and dismissing V'ger as nothing more than an evil space cloud. Paramount, too, considered Star Trek the Motion Picture to be more failure than success, and it's entirely possible that the film was a net loss for the studio. Figuring the actual cost of Star Trek the Motion Picture is tricky, as it was built on the wreckage of multiple previous film projects and the aborted Phase 2. Estimates vary wildly, but the general consensus is that the published budget of $46 million, itself a record high for any Hollywood production at the time, is probably a lowball figure. It also doesn't include the extensive and expensive marketing campaign. However, fans were vocal in their support of the film, and the studio saw enough potential in it to continue the franchise, albeit in a heavily course-corrected direction with Nicholas Meyer and Harve Bennett taking the reins from Gene Roddenberry. Around the turn of the century, Wise approached Paramount with the idea of creating a director's cut of Star Trek the Motion Picture, in which he could reinsert many lost character scenes, recreate some of the lackluster effect shots with modern CGI, and put in the shots that were never made, including the critical V'ger sequences from the climax. The CG work was built to look like it could have been done in 1979, with the effects team even matching the film grain and age to make it as seamlessly integrated as possible. The final result, Star Trek the Motion Picture: The Director's Cut, is a far superior experience than the theatrical version, and it proves that if Paramount had given Wise and his team more time, the film might have been more successful. Still, Star Trek the Motion Picture, director's cut or otherwise, has a tainted reputation, often dismissed as inferior to most of the subsequent sequels, though still superior to Star Trek V, which nobody wants to talk about.
I need my pain!
This, I think, is unfair. Yes, the film, especially the theatrical version, is a slow affair that gets a bit carried away with a 2001-style spectacle, and yes, it was a big tonal shift away from the original series' lighthearted humor. Indeed, with the exception of the cast remaining the same, it is as different to the Star Trek television show that preceded it as the 2009 soft reboot of Star Trek is to it. However, thematically at least, this was a big leap forward for the franchise, an important stepping stone. In the director's cut, where the characters are given enough time to develop properly, it is clear what the writers were trying to convey, that this is a movie about finding meaning in both grounded personal ways and in heady philosophical ones. It is trying to show us that the answers we seek are rarely what we expect, that meaning comes to us when we let go of our preconceptions and arrogance. Just as V'ger is forced to reevaluate the worth of biological life when it learns its creators were human, Spock learns that pure logic is unfulfilling without human emotion, Decker learns that the ambitions of command are a poor substitute for love, and Kirk learns to find happiness in being true to himself. If Star Trek the Motion Picture had truly failed, the franchise would have died with it, and the fact that we're over 50 years into the franchise's existence with no sign of it going anywhere is proof enough that Star Trek the Motion Picture did its job. It laid the groundwork for a franchise that was clawing its way out of cancellation and into true cultural significance, and science fiction would be far lesser today without it. And that's all for today, my fellow Earthlings. If you like what I'm doing here, don't forget to like and subscribe. You can also check out my website at emcgill.com, where I review plenty of science fiction classics in both film and literature. And you can consider joining my Patreon to get early access to videos like this, vote on future topics, and much more. Also, let me know what you think in the comments. Does Star Trek the Motion Picture get too much flack, or should fans ignore it in favor of Star Trek 2? Whatever you think, this is the Unapologetic Geek, telling you to never be ashamed of what you love, as long as you're not hurting anybody.
Problem down there?
He insisted we go first, sir. Said something about first seeing how it scrambled our molecules.